This is probably the biggest display of what hardcore kids talk about, and a lot of kids are like, you know, all talk, no mosh.
What's up, everybody? I'm Finn McKenty. This is the Punk Rock MBA, and welcome back to my How They Changed the Game series. This is where I talk about usually bands that have made some sort of really significant contribution to their genre, but this time I'm gonna switch it up a little bit and talk about a label. Now, a lot of you guys have asked for this. I was kind of not sure where I wanted to start, so I figured, you know what? Why not start with one that's a personal favorite of mine and really close to home, and that is Trustkill Records. For those who don't know, Trustkill was started in 1994 by a guy named Josh Grabelle out in New Jersey. They closed their doors in 2010, but not before making an incredibly important contribution to our scene. I would actually say that because of what Josh and Trustkill did back in the early 2000s, I think that is actually what put metalcore on the map as we know it today. And if you were around back then, if you watched Headbangers Ball or went to Ozzfest or anything like that, then you were almost certainly familiar with Trustkill, or at least familiar with the bands that they put out. For example, 18 Visions, Bleeding Through, Throwdown, Poison the Well, Walls of Jericho, like the list just goes on and on and on. There were definitely other great labels around at that time that deserve a mention and some credit, you know, Eulogy, Ferret, you know, lots of other ones. But in my opinion, Trustkill was really the top of the food chain. I think they just went a little bit bigger than everybody else. Now, before we get into it really quickly, I've been posting a lot more on Instagram lately, so if you like this video or any of my other videos, I would love it if you'd give me a follow over there. There's a link in the description. And with that out of the way, let's get into it. Part 1, the basement shows. Trustkill's first release was in 1994, but the label's roots start a few years earlier than that, in the vibrant hardcore scene of the early 90s tri-state area, which is New Jersey, New York, and Pennsylvania. Trustkill originally started as a zine, and that's actually where I first heard of Trustkill. Back then, in the mid-90s, he was known for having these really sick shows in the basement of his parents' house in suburban New Jersey. To name just a few of the bands he hosted: Hatebreed, Earth Crisis, Lifetime, Broken, Chokehold, Bloodlet, Strife, Snapcase, Undertow, tons more. Just a who's who of the best hardcore bands of those years. I would get my hands on a copy of one of his Trustkill zines or Hardware or one of the other East Coast hardcore zines back then, and I would see all these photos of the shows at his house or Middlesex County College, and I would be so stoked and envious of what was going on there because it seemed like just such a cool scene. So those are the roots of Trustkill, at least from my perspective as someone who was an outsider to that scene. It gave Josh all the raw materials to work with, and he just kind of took that ball and ran with it. And it's a familiar story, right? Because this is how most DIY labels start. Most of them start as somebody who's part of a cool local scene going, man, there's a lot of cool bands here that nobody is signing. I should start a label and document this stuff. And that is exactly what happened with Trustkill. So after a couple years of doing Trustkill as a zine, it became a label in 1994. Part 2, the early years, from roughly 1994 to 2000. The very first release from Trustkill Records was a compilation called Land of Greed, World of Need. And this was a bunch of bands covering the band Embrace, which, as some of you will know, is Ian MacKay's band between Minor Threat and Fugazi, one of the very first emo bands. And for a label's first release, this comp has a pretty insane lineup. It has Rancid, Lifetime, Undertow, Farside, Avail, bunch more awesome bands like that. And that comp really put Trustkill on the map in the hardcore scene. And although I personally kind of skipped it because I don't like Embrace, I definitely took notice of it and I was ready to see more from the label. And after that, it was off to the races. Trustkill dropped one hammer after the next and quickly made a name for itself as the label representing what I guess you could call the new school East Coast hardcore sound. And yes, before anybody points it out, I'm aware that not all their bands are from the East Coast, but you get what I'm saying. They all had that similar sound, that Trustkill sound, which is very heavy, very metallic, but also a little bit discordant with a little bit of a mathy edge that was very fresh and interesting to me at the time. Now, there's a ton, so I can't get into all of them, but a few of the bands and releases that I remember having the biggest impact on the scene during the early years of Trustkill. Despair from Buffalo. This was Scott Vogel of Terror's second band, I believe, after Slugfest. And Harvest's Living with a God Complex. I think these guys were from Minneapolis. They're definitely ahead of the curve with that metallic, discordant kind of sound. And Brothers Keeper, The Continuum. Now, I can't say that I was a big fan of this band's music, but they were definitely a big part of the Ohio and Pennsylvania scene at the time. They did a lot for the community. important thing to point out here is that Trustkill always did a really good job with the packaging and marketing of their releases. These graphics might not look like much today in 2019, but back then, this stuff was very slick compared to almost everything else that was coming out of the hardcore scene at the time. As a couple of examples of what a typical DIY hardcore release would look like at the time, something like this, or this, or this. And as much as I personally appreciate raw DIY packaging, the reality is that if you want to sell more records, slick packaging helps. And on the promotion side, Josh was consistently hustling. He was always sending out promo copies to reviewers, running ads, all that kind of stuff, because with no social media at the time, working with zines and magazines was the best option for creating awareness, and Josh did a great job of it. Every time there was a new Trustkill release, whether I was personally interested in it or not, at least I knew that it was out. And again, although it might sound obvious, this was actually very different from how a lot of DIY labels ran at the time. They would put out one release after the next, but they wouldn't really promote it, and so these records would just end up sitting in a box in somebody's basement for 10 years before they finally gave them to Goodwill. And the reason I mention all of this is because I think people have a tendency to forget that running a label isn't just about knowing which bands are cool, it's also about investing the time and money to package and promote your releases. And yeah, there were other labels at the time that may have done more or less as good of a job as Josh did at the picking cool bands part, but there were very few that did as good of a job at the packaging and promotion part as he did. In any case, after a solid half decade of grinding, I think it was in 1999 when Trustkill really hit its stride, was hitting on all cylinders, and to me there are two releases that made me go like, holy shit, these guys are on another level. First, the Hellfest 2000 DVD. Now if you're not familiar, Hellfest was the first big hardcore festival, not to be confused with the European metal festival of the same name, and Trustkill documented the 2000 Hellfest, which had 18 Visions, Brothers Keeper, One King Down, Every Time I Die, Converge, Nora, Killswitch Engage, and Poison the Well, among many other bands on the bill. Pretty fucking sick lineup, right? Looking at this video now, it might not look like much because, you know, it's 2019, it's been 20 years, but this was by far the most polished, pro production that anybody had ever even attempted for a hardcore festival to date at that time. It was multicam with pretty decent audio. It included a bunch of interviews and B-roll, with my personal favorite being the Brothers Keeper interview where they look like characters from a PlayStation 1 rollerblading game or something. But in all seriousness, this was a big deal because it gave people from all over the world a window into this scene. And I know that this got a lot of people into hardcore. People from all over the world still talk about this as the thing that they would watch over and over and over again to get them stoked on hardcore.
This is probably the biggest display of what hardcore kids talk about, that they're all about. And a lot of kids are like, you know, all talk, no mosh.
And second, the album that I think really took Trustkill from being just a successful hardcore label to something bigger than that, and was also probably the first album that sounds like metalcore as we know it today, which is The Opposite of December by Poison the Well. This is the first album that I'm aware of with all the ingredients, with the syncopated chugs, with the screaming, and the melodic clean choruses. I think this is the template for modern metalcore. And I don't know the exact numbers, but I'm pretty sure this was also their biggest commercial success to date. And to me, it marked the beginning of the next phase of Trustkill, which starts in 2001 when Josh finished law school and made a very tough choice. He chose to do Trustkill full-time rather than pursue a career as an attorney, a decision that was huge for both Josh on a personal level and for the metal and hardcore scene in general. Which brings us to part 3, the golden years, at least according to me, from roughly 2001 to 2006. With Josh's attention fully on Trustkill, this is when the label really took off and broke through the quote-unquote hardcore glass ceiling, bringing this stuff to something maybe not exactly mainstream, but certainly much closer to mainstream than we'd ever gotten at that point. Victory was making big moves around this time too, but remember that their breakthrough bands were not heavy stuff. They were Taking Back Sunday, Hawthorne Heights, that kind of thing, not metalcore or hardcore like Trustkill was doing. And a few minutes earlier, I talked about how there were two parts of running a label. The first, having the ear and relationships to sign the right bands, and the other is putting in the work to market them. And I think Trustkill hit it out of the park on both of these, but especially on the marketing part, and that, I think, is what put metalcore on the map on a global scale. And when I say global, I mean it. This is when millions of people from all over the planet were introduced to metalcore. And while it was by no means exclusively because of Trustkill, Trustkill was, in my opinion, at the forefront of it. They were getting their bands on the biggest platforms available at the time, like the revived version of Headbanger's Ball hosted by Jamie Josta, on Ozzfest, in magazines like Alternative Press, Kerrang, Revolver, just anywhere that they could possibly get their bands, they were there. And if you would have told me in 1999 that I'd be seeing so many of these bands that I'd seen play to 32 people in some shithole venue a couple years ago on MTV just a couple years later, I would have never believed you. But it happened. As a couple examples, first of all, the Orange County bands, 18 Visions, Bleeding Through, Throwdown, all those bands. And if you're not familiar, here's what they sound like. And as a West Coast dude about the same age as all these guys, these bands are very near and dear to me. I remember having Throwdown stay at our house on their first national tour back in 97 or 98. And if you watched any of my other videos, you know how much I love 18 Visions. I actually just saw Hav from 18 Visions at my wedding. So I was very stoked to see Trustkill help these bands get to the level that they did. Or as another example, Walls of Jericho from Detroit. And I lived in Cleveland from 96 to 99, so I remember when these guys were just starting out. And I saw them back in the early years, maybe 98 or 99, open for Cold as Life at some shithole venue in Detroit. And again, to see them end up on Ozzfest 5 years later was super fucking cool to me, because it always feels good for me to see somebody from the hardcore scene get a win like that, to see how far they went, to see all that hard work pay off. And although for sure it's the bands that are out there every day putting in the work, I think you have to give Trustkill some credit as well for making it happen, because that stuff took a real investment. Just to dig into that a little bit further, let me give you one example of what I mean. There's a thing called tour buy-on, which started to become popular back then. Basically what that means is that bands have to pay to get on some tours, and that's actually how Ozzfest worked for smaller bands. If you wanted to get on Ozzfest, you had to pay Sharon a bunch of money. And I don't know how much Trustkill paid to get their bands like Walls of Jericho and Throwdown on Ozzfest, but I've heard of other bands paying like 50 or 100 grand for it, right? And I don't know about you, but that's a lot of fucking money in my book. And the same goes for the music videos. Back then, it was pretty rare for bands like these to have a decent music videos, but Trustkill did videos for all these bands and got them on big outlets like MTV and Fuse. And remember, back then, videos were way, way more expensive to do than they are now. Again, we're talking like tens of thousands of dollars for even a pretty basic video. So those were kind of their flagship bands, but in addition to those bigger bands, they also put out a ton of albums that weren't maybe as commercially successful, but were really fucking good, that still hold up today. A few that I want to call out as examples of some of my favorite releases from this time. First of all, Terror, One with the Underdogs. Easily the best hardcore album ever made in this style. I don't think anybody will ever do that kind of hardcore better than Terror did.
Always against the odds! Fight with the underdogs!
Second, First Blood, California. Hopes Fall, The Satellite Years. Very happy to see that so many people recognize this band even all these years later. And lastly, Bedlight for Blue Eyes, Life on Life's Terms. I know really absolutely nothing about this band, but they had a great sound. Really seemed like they could have gotten bigger.
Trying not to waste my time tonight. Honey, on the road, 'cause it was so right.
And speaking of Trustkill bands that could have gotten a lot bigger, let's talk about It Dies Today, because they were definitely one of those bands.
It's the way she looks at me, senses me to come back ahead of anyone.
They had a ton of hype around their first album, and it's easy to see why. They had perfect timing for that gothic metalcore mini trend that was really hot around 2005, with, of course, Bleeding Through being the big dogs and other bands like I Am Ghost, and It Dies Today were pretty damn good at it. So they put out that first album, got quite a bit of hype, but then they lost their singer. They kind of stumbled a bit, never really recaptured the momentum that they had, but I do still hear people bring them up a lot even now, so they definitely had something. And a couple other bands that were worth mentioning, maybe a little bit more on the rock side of things. First of all, Crash Romeo. Now, I can't say that I was a fan of this band, but they did have quite a bit of hype.
Waiting for the moment to take their breath away.
And it's pretty fun watching this video as a time capsule of like the 2005 scene look, which honestly has not aged very well. And second, Fight Paris. I also just didn't really personally care for this band, but they were objectively pretty damn good at what they did, very ahead of their time. For any of you guys who are into Every Time I Die, you may want to check these guys out.
You got it coming and you don't even know it. In just a minute, I'll make you show it.
And as far as I'm aware, the crown jewel of the Trustkill catalog is Bullet For My Valentine's first album, The Poison, which isn't very interesting to me personally, a little bit too much on the hard rock kind of side of things for me, but it was huge for Trustkill. It sold over 2 million copies worldwide, which is just massive for an indie label of Trustkill size, and it also put Bullet For My Valentine on track to become one of the bigger metal bands of their generation that I think was one of those gateway bands that got a lot of kids into metal and hardcore over the years to come. And I could keep going, but I think you get the idea. Trustkill had a hell of a decade. Over the course of roughly 1996 to 2006, they put metalcore on the map in a way that I honestly never thought I would see, and I think they paved the way for Rise to really blow it up a few years later. But nothing lasts forever, and that was the case for Trustkill as well. Which brings us to part 4, The End, from roughly 2007 to 2010. For those of you who wondered what led to the demise of Trustkill in 2010, it all started in 2007 when they signed a distribution deal with a company called Fontana that was part of Universal. And Universal, as some of you guys may know, are one of the like 2 or 3 biggest music distribution companies on the planet. These guys are the big boys, and if you're one of the little guys, they can either do a lot to help you or they can crush you like a bug. So as far as what happened, I'm just gonna tell it in Josh's words from an interview he did with my good friends over at No Echo. The deal was great and the people we did the deal with were awesome. Unfortunately, the head of the company died shortly after and the guy who spearheaded the deal quit. And this is pretty typical for any label or band doing a deal with a major, unfortunately. Fast forward a year and there's a whole new staff of people who didn't like the deal we'd agreed upon previously. This put us in a bad spot and we tried everything to work it out, but it just couldn't work. Now, I'm not sure exactly what the specific issue was that got between Trustkill and their distributor, but for whatever reason, Josh felt like his only choice was to step away from Trustkill and start something new, which he did with his current label, Bullet Tooth. Bullet Tooth has been around since I think 2010 now and has put out albums by some familiar bands like First Blood, Earth Crisis, and Memphis May Fire, as well as some newer faces that kind of just pick up where Trustkill left off, probably the most notable ones being Affiance and Death Ray Vision, who have ex-members of a few bands you may have heard of, such as Killswitch Engage and Overcast. And I know that a lot of you guys are going to ask about the beef and the drama, about all the things that bands like Hopes Fall and Bleeding Through and some other people have said about Trustkill ripping them off or ruining their albums, all that stuff. And if you're one of those people, you're probably going to be disappointed by this video because I really don't have anything to say about it. I'm only bringing it up here because I know it's going to come up and I do need to address it, but I'm really not interested in litigating that here. So if that's what you're after, I would encourage you to just read some of the interviews that Josh has done where he's given his side of the story and decide for yourself what you think happened. I'll link to a couple of those in the description if you want to check it out. So with that out of the way, I think it's time to wrap this video up, which brings us to part 5, a couple closing thoughts. So like I said in the beginning, I think it's fair to say that whatever criticisms you may have of Trustkill, they did put metalcore on the map. And if you love the genre as much as I do, then that's something to be stoked for. But to me, the biggest lesson to take away from the Trustkill story is about what it takes to get traction for your work as a creator. And here's what I mean. Whether you're making music, a podcast, a comic book, or any other kind of creative product, the mistake that so many creators make is thinking that they can just make a great piece of work, release it into the world, and then if it's good, people will just kind of find it and success will fall into their lap, that it will succeed on its own merits just because it's great work and the world rewards great work, right? Yeah, I wish. I wish that's the way things worked, but as many of you guys have found out, I'm sure that is just not how it works. Making something great is only the first step. That's where the real work begins. After you put the thing out, you gotta hustle your ass off to promote the thing, and that usually means investing a lot of time and sometimes a lot of money. Just like how Josh invested hundreds of thousands of dollars into ads, music videos, and tour support to promote the albums he put out. Now, don't get me wrong, I definitely do not think money can buy success, and all the advertising dollars in the world are not going to make a crappy product into a success, so I'm not suggesting that you just throw money into ads. My point is that I've seen so many people put a ton of time and money into creating something, but then starve it to death by not putting the same level of investment into promoting it. So remember this, if you're doing something cool that the world needs to know about, remember that creating it is only the first step. Put just as much time, energy, and money into promotion as you do into creation, and watch mountains move. All right, guys, that's how I think Trustkill changed the game. What do you think? Do you remember any of those bands? Do you remember seeing that stuff on Ozzfest or Headbangers Ball and going, holy shit, they got hardcore on MTV? Am I the only one that felt that way? What was your favorite Trustkill band or release? Do you agree with me that they laid the groundwork for, I think, what Rise and other labels will go on to do at the end of the decade? And also, I want to hear your thoughts on the last thing that I said about how so many creators kind of lose their way at the last mile there, where they put the thing out but they don't promote it as much. Is that something you've observed? Do you feel like maybe you've done that with your own work? Let me know in the comments. And again, really quickly, if you like this video, if you like any of my other videos, I would love it if you would give me a follow on Instagram. There's a link in the description. And with that, I will sign off for now, but I will see you next time.